no numbers, there's no pictures, there's no videos, there's no gameplay. I don't like it.
Yo, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Hope you guys are doing well. Hope everyone's having a good day so far. And today, Freemers, we are back with another Free Realm Sunrise video. This time around, we're going back behind the story of the Realm War. This is part 4. These next 5 chapters are, they go pretty deep, man. There's gonna be a lot of revelations. I believe chapter 20 is where things are going to get really interesting, because if you've noticed throughout this entire story, I haven't actually brought in a new location into the story. And if you guys remember, Luck of the Draw was where I first introduced 4 locations that never made it into Free Realms, which I had a lot of fun doing. I think I don't know, it's part of the reason why Luck of the Draw is what it is, and I don't know, it was fun to write. It was a lot of fun to write. And then with Sunrise Stories, there wasn't a lot of, I didn't include a lot of the new locations into Sunrise Stories, but I tried to get, I tried to include stories for every single location. And then, the Realm War here has only one new location, because obviously you can only talk about so many different areas so much. I mean, Silver Hills is in this, and then all of Sacred Grove, but when you get down to nitty gritty, there hasn't been anything new so far. Look out for chapter 20, because that's when we're introducing one here. Not going to spoil what it is, but you can probably guess what it is. And that's all I'll say. Give it a guess if you've already read through it, you know. But give it a guess, and yeah, man, let's just let's not stall anymore. Let's get into chapter 16 here. We're going through chapter 16 through 20, all the way until 21, and that's when I'll pause, take a break. We'll come back for the finale. But yeah, man, this is chapter 16, Pursuit. So this takes place right after 15. Kind of a it's going to be a continuous story now. There's not really going to be a lot of jumping from different characters, but yeah, let's get into it. As we were leaving Greenwood Forest, Maya looked at me and asked, "So why did you leave Silver Hills without me?" I sighed and asked, "It's a long story. Could we talk about it later?" She nodded and said, "Yeah, that's fine." Kale shrugged and said, "To be fair, there's a lot going on right now." I nodded and asked, "Speaking of, why were you in Greenwood Forest?" She looked at Chatty and said, We were looking all over Sacred Grove for you, Dane. We saw smoke in Greenwood Forest, and we decided to help in any way we could." I smiled and said, "Well, you and Chatty did a lot for us. We wouldn't have found out that the Chaos Amulet still exists without your help." She sighed and said, "Those other 3 Treebles helped too. Their names were Jax, Ludo, and Ezra. They didn't deserve to die like that." Kale sighed and said, "Well, don't worry. As soon as we find Bale, I'll take him down." I turned to him and asked, "You'll take him down? He threw you into that crater. How do you expect to fight him this time?" He chuckled and said, "Well, for starters, I have a weapon. Yet you, Kensington, do not." I sighed and said, "You have a point. You missed it, Maya, but Bale snapped my mallet in 2. Maya shook her head and said, "You've had that mallet ever since we met in Briarwood." I nodded and said, "I'll get a new one forged, but we can worry about that later. The sooner we get to Queensfields, the sooner we can find Bale and put all of this to rest." Maya looked at Chatty and said, "Dane, there's something you need to know." I tilted my head and said, "Maya, hold that thought. Something's not right." We arrived in Queensfields, but it wasn't the same place we remembered. The fields were overrun by both Chug-a-Wug soldiers and elven mages. So, for those who kind of missed what happened in 15, basically Luthias, Chugsy, Bale, and the whole elven army that Luthias brought with went to Sanctuary after they talked with Dane. What's also what I kind of made happen is Darkthorn and Chugug, they were overlooking the whole thing with the Chugawug army they had. They went to Sanctuary before Luthias and Bale and Chugsy did. So the fact that they went to the same place, I made it so basically I wrote it that way because I wanted there to be conflict there and be like, oh, it's Darkthorn's army versus Luthias's army. And I thought that was an interesting little situation, but I don't think I did a great job of conveying the fight that was going on, but I did my darndest. I tried with this, but let's keep going here. I looked at the fields and asked, I don't understand. Why is there an army of elves at our front door? Kale shrugged and said, well, it could be worse. It's not the Gloam invasion, that's for sure. I sighed and said, still, it could turn out that way if we don't stop this. Maya looked at me and said, this is what I needed to tell you. Luthias and Chugsy are here, but I didn't know they brought their entire army. I nodded and said, well, I know Luthias is here. I spoke to him not too long ago. She tilted her head and asked, you spoke to him? What did he say? I shrugged and said, he told me that he was going to discuss things with Valerian. I thought he meant peacefully, not violently. Maya sighed and asked, did you know that Bale is working for Luthias? I turned to her and said, no, I didn't. That explains why Bale came out of nowhere and why Luthias was at the dig site. Kale thought for a moment and said, so this Luthias guy has the Chaos Amulet. If he and Bale are working together, we have no idea what we're walking into. I sighed and said, well, there's only one way to find out. Let's find a way into Sanctuary. We traversed through the fields and climbed up the left side of Sanctuary into an alleyway. We were hidden in between two buildings and we took a moment to catch our breath. I sighed and said, look, despite everything that's going on, I still trust Luthias. Maya turned to me and asked, really? His army is tearing apart Sanctuary and Bale murdered those Treebles. Why do you still trust him? I shrugged and said, there has to be a reason for the Elven army and Bale. He probably wanted to be cautious and brought them along. He only wanted to discuss the rule of Sacred Grove with Valerian. Darkthorn's army probably started this. Kale sighed and said, if he wanted to have a discussion with Valerian, he should have come here alone. She nodded and said, Kale's right. However, I trust you, Dane. If you believe there's more going on with Luthias, then we'll get answers. I smiled and said, all right, let's move out. Before we could, Chatty finally woke up. He looked at Maya and asked, where am I? She sighed and said, you're in Sanctuary, Chatty. She looked around and asked, where are the others? She started to tear up and said, they didn't make it, Chatty. They were murdered by the knight known as Bale. I wish there was more I could have done, but I saved you from him. He looked at Maya's wings and said, your wings? You put yourself in harm's way for me, and for that, I am forever grateful. He jumped out of Maya's arms and turned to us. He tilted his head and asked, who are they, Maya? Maya smiled and said, this is Dane Kensington III, and that is Kale Yardbird. They were on the other side of where we were in Greenwood Forest. I nodded and said, it's a pleasure to finally meet the mascot of Sacred Grove, but I wish it was under better circumstances. He sighed and said, me too. As the last remaining Treeble, I will do everything in my power to avenge my kind. Kale shook his head and said, hold your horses, Chatty. Elves and Chugawugs are fighting out in the streets. We need to be cautious if we want to find a way to the capital. He tilted his head and asked, elves and Chugawugs? Fighting in Sanctuary? How much have I missed? Maya sighed and said, too much, Chatty. Hop onto my back. That way we'll stay out of harm's way. Until we can find you some gear. He nodded and jumped onto Maya's back. The way he rested on her almost resembled a backpack. Okay, so I kind of, if any of you have actually played Free Realms, like any of you Freemers out there, that's a cool nod I wrote into the actual Chatty Bat Pack in the game. So yeah, I basically had Maya Chatty jump onto Maya's back because obviously she doesn't have wings anymore. So basically he's Chatty is basically Maya's wings almost. Which I thought was kind of cool to do, but also having Chatty rest on her because in a way Chatty and Maya are now connected. And I think that's a really cool thing to write in. But anyway, let's keep going. Whew. Hold on, I'm gonna drink something. Whoo-wee. All right. We left the alleyway and maneuvered through the streets of Sanctuary. Elves were using their magic to nullify the Chuggawugs from fighting. It seemed like the battle was coming to a decisive end in the elven favor. I looked at the elves and asked, "Why aren't they attacking us?" Maya shrugged and said, "Luthias must have told them to leave us unharmed. However, he called me a traitor when he walked by Chatty and I, so I don't know why I'm still unharmed." I looked at her and said, "That doesn't make much sense. Still, I'm sure everything will be explained once we reach the capital." Kale sighed and said, "Yeah, but more than that, I hope Bale's ready to face defeat." Chatty smiled and said, "We'll take him down together, Kale. I'll make sure of it." I looked at the World Tree and said, "There's no turning back from this. Whatever Luthias is planning, I hope it saves us from Valerian and whatever she was planning to do with the stones." So, it's interesting, like, Maya has told Dane, like, oh, all of this happened, and I wrote it like, you know, Dane still trusts Luthias because, I mean, Luthias is the one, like, they're, in some way, like, Luthias is all, like, Luthias is almost family. Not, like, blood family, but, like, Luthias is the reason Dane knows about his parents, knows about everything. So Luthias is kind of that guardian to Dane. Like, he trusts him in that way. And he's kind of, like, not believing that Luthias is a bad guy. So, for some reason, Dane believes that there is still good in Luthias because of, you know, his parents. But yeah, so anyway, let's get into the next chapter, which is chapter 17, Fusion. We made it up the hill and approached the capital. Right outside of the doors laid Valerian and Darkthorn, cuffed together with elven magic. Luthias, Chugsy, and Bale, alongside two other elven mages, were standing all around them. Luthias smiled and said, "Dane, it's about time you arrived. It took some time, but we managed to convince Valerian to surrender to our kind." I sighed and said, "Luthias, I saw what your army did out there, in the streets of Sanctuary. You didn't need to resort to violence for a discussion." He shook his head and said, "When push comes to shove, I had no other choice but to act accordingly. It was Darkthorn's army that started all of this bloodshed." Darkthorn turned to him and said, "Like hell it was, you elvish fool." He used elven magic to cover her mouth and said, "Silence, dark witch. If it was up to me, you wouldn't be a part of this encounter. Yet, here we are, all together in Sanctuary." I sighed and asked, "So, what's your endgame, Luthias?" He smiled and said, "Well, for starters, I promised you when we last met that I'd get you the answers you deserve. After all, you're one of us." Maya turned to me and asked, "What does he mean by that?" Luthias looked at Maya and said, "Oh, he didn't tell you. Dane, there's no need to be ashamed of who you truly are. He is half elf, half human. On the outside, he looks nothing like us. However, on the inside, he is our blood through and through." Maya looked at me and asked, "Why didn't you tell me? Was this the reason you ran out of Silver Hills like that?" I nodded and said, "I was going to explain later, but that's the reason." Luthias nodded and said, "Now, on to the business at hand. Dane, you desired answers from Valerian. I suggest you start asking questions." I looked at Valerian and asked, "To start, I need to know something. I felt different after 8 years of slumber. I didn't know who I was or what I was supposed to be doing. Was everything in my life leading up to the Gloam invasion a lie? She sighed and said, not all of it. However, Ayani tampered with your memories to ensure you had a life of pure bliss. I sighed and asked, so everything about my mom and I moving in with my uncle, my dad leaving us, my mom sending me to school to learn gymnastics, all of it was a lie? She nodded and said, I'm sorry, Dane. I tried to protect you from the truth, but I see now that was a mistake. Okay, so real quick, I want to bring this up because I think it's pretty important. The fact that there's stuff in the comics that's mentioned about Dane's mom, uncle, dad, gymnastics, like all this stuff about him going to school. It's just stuff he's saying in his head. Like, he doesn't actually say any of this out loud for the most. Well, he says some stuff out loud, but I took that story from the comic book, like that information from Dane, and I thought Ayani might have done something to make him forget about his own parents. So I thought Ayani put all of this information in Dane's head as a kid, like mom moving in with uncle, even though there probably wasn't a mom there. Like his dad, like there's a lot of pieces here that fit in with the story I was trying to tell about Dane, about him having an elven dad and a human mom. That makes a lot of sense, and like, you know, Ayani messed with his memories. And it's wild. If you're reading this, you're like, whoa, okay. So the comics were telling kind of a false lie almost, like Ayani screwed with Dane's memory. So I think, realistically, I do think Ayani is a villain, and Ayani, I think, raised the royal family kind of wrong. There's a lot of it. I mean, in any royal family, there's a lot of issues, like Darkthorn leaving to go to Briarwood because she was blamed for the death of Valerian's for their parents. Joffrey wanting to take over the throne. There's so many different things. And it's the whole reason I wrote this in. It's like, yeah, Ayani is the villain. She was wrong in what she did, but like, and now it's all kind of coming to fruition. This next part I am going to pause and talk about once we read through it, because it's important. So yeah, let's keep going. I thought for a moment and asked, Luthias showed me that Ayani imprisoned my real parents years ago. So where are they now? She sighed and said, they're not here. Sadly, they're not in Sacred Grove. I tilted my head and asked, what do you mean they're not here? Where are they? She sighed and said, I can't give you that information. Ayani made me promise to keep the location a secret. So, this location, so Dane's parents are not in Sacred Grove. This is that new location I was talking about that I'm going to introduce in chapter 20. It's very important. So, just putting that out there, like, there is context about where they actually are right there. So, let's keep going. Luthias sighed and said, still this false queen keeps her secrets. Why am I not surprised? I looked at him and asked, secrets? What else are you hiding? He smiled and said, more than she would care to admit. He grabbed 2 stones from Chugsy and showed them to me. I looked at the stones and asked, the Gloam stone and another stone like it? How is this possible? Chugsy sighed and said, it appears that Valerian used the Gleam stone, the other stone, to bring the Gloam stone back to life. Luthias nodded and said, we stopped her before she could use them against us. A queen with a lust for power is not deserving of the crown, even if it is heavy. So, yeah, basically, in Sunrise Stories, if you guys have missed it, Valerian has a stone called the Gleam Stone, and it's essentially the first stone that changed all of Sacred Grove. Like, it's the reason Crystal Barrier is up, It's the reason warp stones were created. And she has this gleam stone. And basically at the start of this, there was a reason Valerian was looking for the husk of the glowstone, because she was trying to bring it back to life. She brought the glowstone back with power from the gleamstone. So, as crazy as it sounds, there is, like, a genuine reason for it, but it's like, she's afraid, in my head, Valerian is afraid to rule as a queen, because, you know, Ayani was the ruler, and, like, she kind of just fell into power, because, you know, her parents just were killed by Joffrey, and dude, it's a lot. It's a lot to take in. And if you read through that story in Sunrise Stories, you'll know I put a lot in there about Valerian and like her like going through the Crees, and there's a lot she has to do as ruler. So it's a lot, and she needed help, and she thinks the stones can help. And we're gonna cover that reading through. But anyway, let's keep going. Valerian looked at Luthias and said, "You don't know what it's like to rule without guidance. My hand has been forced to keep the order in Sacred Grove. If that means using power beyond my own means, then so be it." He knelt down to Valerian and said, "I've ruled far longer than you have. You will not keep us bound by some stone." She shook her head and said, "Chugsy told me your city is far more advanced than ours. You were fine behind that crystal barrier." He sighed and said, "That's where you're wrong, Valerian. You see, even paradise is a prison when you can't leave." He stood up, then looked at me and said, "Well, what's done is done. We can't change the past, no matter how hard we try." Maya looked at the stones and asked, "What do you plan on doing with those?" He chuckled and said, "I'm glad you asked. Chugsy tells me that a man by the name of Baron von Darkcheat used one of these to try and change the realms forever. However, he failed to realize the full potential of using the elements all together." Luthias placed the Chaos Amulet around his neck and held both of the stones in his hands. He turned to Bale and said, "Eliminate Valerian and her sister Darkthorn." He nodded, and before he could, Darkthorn broke free of the elven magic, then said, "You can't end our lives." Luthias tilted his head and asked, "Why is that? Is it because you're royalty?" Valerian nodded and said, "If you take us down, Sacred Grove and every realm like it will cease to exist. That includes Silver Hills." So one thing I want to point out here is Luthias, he's never, like, you never know Luthias's true intentions throughout even the end of Sunrise Stories or even leading up to this. You don't know his true intentions. Like, you don't know what kind of person he is until this moment. So he intends on using the Chaos Amulet and both of the stones at the same time, which, I mean, in my opinion, it makes him the most powerful being in the Free Realms. Just bare minimum, he is the most powerful person. Now on to this other point with Darkthorn saying you can't end our lives. So I had this, like, there's this weird, it's a weird theory. But there's this thing called the Heart Seed in Free Realms, and essentially it's just like, it's like a part, like that, it's a thing that came from Ayani, and I wrote in Luck of the Draw that if either Valerian or Darkthorn die, like, Sacred Grove ceases to, or the Free Realms cease to exist. Like, there was like a connection with them and the Free Realms that make it so everything would just turn to dirt, and that's that. And I probably touched on it in Luck of the Draw, but here it's actually becoming a reality. Like, oh, they could die. Like, they could actually die, and there's kind of no way to stop it. So yeah, I thought that was an interesting point to just bring up, like, hey, if you kill us, everything here is gone. So, yeah. And I was trying to figure out a way to tackle this, and we're going to read that part now. So let's let's get back into it. I'm going to drink some fluids. All right, here we go. He thought for a moment and said, "How interesting. Well, if we can't eliminate you, then I will siphon your souls into the stones to ensure the realms stay intact without your influence." Luthias activated the Chaos Amulet and bonded with both of the stones. He summoned the Chaos Beast to his side and used the stones to boost his elven magic. We stood there in complete silence, not knowing what to do. So yeah, Luthias is the most powerful being in sacred, like, in the entire Free Realms, which is just wild to me, because you think of, like, Dark Chi, and, like, he only had one stone, along with, like, sorcery he obtained, I guess, but, like, and I do actually cover how he got that sorcery in here, which we will go over later. But yeah, dude literally is the most powerful being in the Free Realms, which is crazy because he's got elven magic, he's super smart, he's a king, he's got the Chaos Beast by his side along with the Chaos Amulet, he's got both the Gleamstone and the Gloamstone. Dude is like he's practically invincible. It's crazy, and I think I made a perfect villain, because Dark Chi was already written, he was already a villain, but I expanded on him a lot. But yeah, again, just to me, I think this is a really cool villain. Like, you've got a guy that just doesn't want to be trapped in Silver Hills anymore, and he wants to take down the people who did this to him in the first place, and oh my god, he's getting his vengeance, all right. It's just wild to me. But anyway, let's keep going. Chapter 18, Withstand. Chugsy took a step back and said, "Luthias, you've gone too far. We came here to take Valerian out of power, not to become what the Realm Keeper sought to destroy." Luthias shook his head and said, "You're not seeing the full picture, Chugsy. For the Free Realms to thrive, we all must evolve." I looked at Luthias and said, "Put that thing back in the amulet before Sacred Grove is destroyed." He sighed and said, "The two of you turning against me. You were meant for greater things, Dane. Greater than this." I looked at Valerian, then back at Luthias and said, "If the choice is between the greater and lesser evil, then the choice itself is flawed." He chuckled and said, "Still, the brighter the light shines, the darker the shadow it casts. Whether or not you choose a side, you'll always be forgotten in the end." Kale shook his head and said, "We're still here. As long as we're alive, we won't be forgotten." He nodded and said, "I'll make sure the realms forget all of you. Bale, make them kneel before you." He readied his sword and said, "With pleasure, Luthias." He charged at me and I avoided his attack as fast as I could. I looked at Kale and said, I don't have my mallet. This is gonna be harder without a weapon." Kale shrugged and said, "You could fight with your fists." I rolled my eyes and asked, "Against Bale's armor? Are you being serious?" He laughed and said, "No." Oh, wait. Oh, frick, man. I literally hate myself right now. Because, like, dude. Oh. Really? Okay. Alright, well, that's fine. Whatever. He laughed and said, "No, but don't worry. Maya, Chugsy, and I will take the trash out. If you're on our side, Chugsy." Chugsy nodded and said, "I always have been. I was just blinded by loyalty to Luthias, and I didn't see his true intentions. I'll fight with you and for the Realm Keepers until..." I guess I'll put until the very end. We'll just change that a little bit. Hey, man, it happens. Until the end. There we go. Alright. Cool, back to viewing. "I'll fight with you and for the Realm Keepers until the end." So yeah, Chugsy basically, he changes sides pretty quickly, and I do have my reason for writing it like that, because again, Luthias's true intentions aren't shown until this very moment. And I mean, the thing was, like, Chugsy thought Luthias was just gonna take Valerian out of power, not go power hungry, you know? So that's the reason why there's such a quick switch to sides, because he never wanted this at all. So yeah, also something to note, these chapters are pretty quick up until chapter 20, which we are going to be reading, but just wanted to point that out. Kale rushed into Bale and their swords clashed. Kale smiled and said, "You're not getting away this time, Bale. We'll have you on the ropes in no time." He chuckled and said, "Is that so? If you were a true warrior, then you'd know you're outmatched." Kale shook his head and said, "Think again. I'm not alone in this fight." Kale pushed back against Bale and hit his armor with his sword. They clashed swords again, and Kale held his own. He sighed and said, "I can't hold him for long. Some help would be nice, Chugsy." He nodded and said, "I'm working on it. Spell casting isn't instantaneous, you know." Maya turned to him and asked, "What can I do?" He sighed and said, "Leave the Treble here and help Kale in his fight. I'll work on this spell and hopefully this will all be over soon." Whew. Okay. I'm trying to think how many characters are here right now, because, like, I have my, hold on. I have a notepad. Oh, can I even... Hold on. Who was all here? I think there's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, that makes sense. There's 5 people. So yeah, there is like a huge it's funny. It's almost like an Avengers type of team here, but like you've got Dane, Maya, Kale, Chatty, and Chugsy. Yeah, it's crazy. It's wild. But yeah, let's keep going. Where did I leave off? I'll work on this spell and hopefully this will all be over soon. Maya pulled out her katana and swiftly ran towards Bale. She held her blade against his and doubled Kale's hold against Bale. Maya sighed and said, "You're going to pay for what you did to Chatty's friends and for clipping my wings. I won't let you leave here." Bale shook his head and said, "You're going to regret interfering in this fight, little girl. I won't go easy on either of you." They held Bale in place until Chugsy could finalize the spell. Chatty looked at Chugsy and said, "My friend suffered because of him." He sighed and said, "If I had known what Bale was doing, I would have tried to stop him. Instead, I sat idly by while Bale took the lives of your friends. I'm sorry for everything. I only wish I could have done more for them." Chatty sighed and said, "Me too. If we take down Bale, their memories will be preserved. I'll always remember them." I ran over to Chugsy and Chatty, then asked, "How are we looking?" Chugsy shrugged and said, "The spell's almost ready. Once I cast it, you and Maya need to stop Luthias from unleashing that power onto the 3 realms. Chatty, I'll need you to be my eyes in the sky. That way Kale and I can keep Bale busy." I nodded and said, "All right, just give us a signal." Chugsy took a deep breath and finalized the spell, then readied it. He looked at us and exclaimed, "Maya, Kale, disperse." They moved and he casted it, hitting Bale directly. Bale stumbled backwards and remained stunned by the spell. Chugsy sighed and said, "Dane, Maya, make your way inside the capital. We'll handle things from here." We nodded and followed Luthias into the world tree. So yeah, they actually managed to stun Bale with a spell, and Chugsy's spell casting is going to be, I would say, kind of crucial in this moment. At least very crucial in my opinion, because the thing is about Chugsy, he is the only one that could take Bale. I think personally could take Bale or Luthias, because one, Luthias and Chugsy are the same, like they're the same race. As far as Bale goes, I mean, he's a knight that, you know, they're pretty much neighbors in that sense. So I think Chugsy is the only one who can do actual damage to anyone here, but that's my 2 cents. But anyway, we got 2 more chapters left here in this part. So yeah, let's move on to chapter 19. Succumb. It was quiet. We tried listening for Darkthorn and Valerian, but there was nothing. Maya looked at me and asked, "Where could he have gone?" I shrugged and said, "Your guess is as good as mine. I thought he had good intentions, but I was wrong." "I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." She sighed and said, "It's fine, Dane. What matters now is saving the free realms from destruction. Later, you'll have to explain this whole elf thing to me." I nodded and said, "I'll do my best. It was a lot for me to process after I had left Silver Hills." She tilted her head and asked, "You know, you can count on me for anything, right, Dane?" I nodded and said, "I've known that ever since we met, Maya." We both smiled and kept searching through the world tree. We finally came across Valerian and Darkthorn, then saw Luthias standing over them. The Chaos Beast was nowhere to be found, and that concerned me. Luthias smiled and said, "Dane, I had such high hopes for you. You could have been next in line to take the throne, but instead, you betrayed your own race." I scoffed and said, "I've been a human for most of my life. I'd say who I am doesn't matter at this point. I don't need a bloodline to know right from wrong, Luthias. Clearly, you've forgotten the difference and desire more power than Valerian did." He laughed and said, "I'm doing this for Silver Hills, Dane. You'd realize that if you weren't so blind. Regardless, this is the end for the both of you. Chaos Beast, drown them in shadow." So the interesting about the Chaos Beast is, like, it doesn't talk ever. And for those who don't know what the Chaos Beast is, it's explained in the comics, but Chaos Beast is something that's supposedly supposed to terrorize Free Realms. But to me, it's like, this thing came out of nowhere, because, like, they created this Chaos Amulet and Chaos Beast, and I feel like it's weird lore, but, like, I wanted to make the Chaos Beast a little more relevant in terms of terrorizing Free Realms. And yeah, so also, it's a beast cloaked in shadow. Like, the reason Dane and Maya couldn't see it is because, strictly put, it was basically their shadow. Like, I'd like to think the Chaos Beast is something that can blend in with, like, shadows, and, like, that's why you can't see it, because it's always lurking, you know? I'm gonna drink something before we keep going, because chapter 20 is, well, it's not too long. It's not a super long chapter, I don't think. I don't remember how long I made any of the chapters, but I can't remember really, because all of this is kind of fresh. But yeah, let's keep going. Before we could even move, the Chaos Beast grabbed us. I tried to break free, but I felt powerless against the beast. Maya looked at Luthias and asked, "Is this really worth destroying the Free Realms?" He shook his head and said, "Destroy? Oh, you've got it all wrong, Maya. Once I siphon their souls, I intend on rebuilding every realm from the ground up." I shook my head and said, "This isn't right, Luthias. You know this, and still we persist against all odds." Luthias sighed and said, "Enough. This will be done, and it seems you both need to be taught a lesson." He pointed both of the stones at the ground and opened a cerulean portal. Valerian looked at the portal and said, "Luthias, you can't send them through." He turned to her and asked, "Why should I listen to the overthrown queen?" She sighed and said, "If you do this, they will not be able to return to our world. They will be lost." He thought for a moment and asked, "Is that so? Does your sister share that same sentiment?" Darkthorn nodded and said, "It's true. Despite our differences, sending Dane and Maya down there is a death sentence." Luthias nodded and said, "Very well. If sending them through takes them out of the equation, then that's fine by me." Luthias used the Chaos Amulet and commanded the beast to drop us into the portal. The Chaos Beast released us, and we fell through. So this whole cerulean portal thing, I love that word, cerulean. It's like a color, and I didn't know that, but it's such a cool word, and I was like, what color should the portal be? Cerulean. Oh, it just worked out. And the word cerulean I used a lot throughout this, and this next chapter is introducing the new world. And we're just gonna start the chapter, and we're gonna finish it. And then the finale will go over the next 5 chapters, including an epilogue. So, but let's get into it. Chapter 20, Underworld. So, the Underworld is a location in Free Realms that has never been talked about. It was like revealed in concept art. Like there was, I guess it was like the first place that was like, there was concept art made for it. It's like there was an early build of it. And I don't remember when this was mentioned. I think it was mentioned last year. The Underworld, like someone actually talked about it, and was like, yeah, this is an early world that was supposed to be in Free Realms, but never made the cut. And I wanted to give it a shot and see if I could bring it to life in the realm more. Now, my version of the Underworld is kind of different from the vision that SOE had for it, but I do hope you guys enjoy my take on it. I think I did the devs justice on this part of Free Realms, and yeah, without a further ado, let's get into it. We fell out. Oh, I'm gonna drink something first before I start. I don't want to, you know, I don't want to blow out my voice, but it might happen. Let's see, again, I don't remember. I believe there's 3 chapters just going over. Well, there might be 4. I don't remember. No, there's 3. It's only 3 chapters going over the Underworld, and then the other 3. Well, you'll see when we talk about them, but I'm going to drink some water as well. All right. Here we go, man. No turning back. We fell out of the portal and stumbled down a rocky mountain. We rolled onto freshly laid soil, and the world looked completely different from Sacred Grove. By the way, this image, it's from Steam. By the way, I think this came from the whole Fabled Realms drama, if you guys remember that. So silly, dude. But I saw this image on that Steam page, and I was like, I can use this for reference. But I also believe it's from, like, you know when you'd go out of bounds in Free Realms and you would walk on dirt and you would see like mountains and blue sky? I thought that was such a cool concept, and I brought it to life in the Underworld. So, yeah, without further ado, let's keep going. We rolled onto freshly laid soil, and the world looked completely different from Sacred Grove. I looked at the sky and asked, "Where the hell are we?" Maya shrugged and said, "Wherever Luthias sent us. I wish Valerian would have told us more about it." I sighed and said, "Ayani made her promise to keep this place a secret. Even if we find out where we are, she said we won't be able to return to Sacred Grove." She looked around and asked, "Well, if we're going to be here for a while, we might as well keep moving forward." We walked for so long, it felt like forever. Every step we took through the soil kept sending us 2 miles backwards. Maya looked at me and asked, "So, you're part elf. How'd you find that out?" I sighed and said, "I suppose this is the best time to discuss it, since we're in the middle of nowhere." Luthias recognized my last name and showed me images of people on this thing called the Everflow. He told me that my father was his right hand in Silver Hills. She thought for a moment and asked, "You look nothing like an elf. What convinced you that you are one?" I chuckled and said, "That's what I said to Luthias, but he showed me memories that had been suppressed in the far reaches of my mind." She nodded and said, "That explains what you were asking Valerian about, but go on." I sighed and said, "Luthias said that my father grew distant from Silver Hills. He met a woman that would soon be my mother, then he showed me the memory. My mother and father were arguing about the life I deserved to live, but I was hiding in a closet during the memory. Ayani and the royal guards arrested them. Then Ayani found me and took me in." She started to tear up and said, "Your parents are missing, just like mine." I nodded and said, "My uncle fought for me. After all of that happened, he's the reason I still had a small connection to a family. I feel bad for treating the way I did, but knowing that Ayani tampered with my own memories was probably the reason. I was under her influence, so kind of a little neat thing there is like, it's not really said at all when Dane asks about his memories, but yeah, for the most part, Ayani was controlling Dane up until obviously she died, but that's what Dane believes. He's like, I was under her influence the entire time I went on those missions for Valerian. It's like like it's wild to think about. Like Dane was under mind control almost. Like, dude, imagine if your memories were just altered and you were a completely different person. Like, to me, that's a wild thought to be like, oh, so now I'm this person. Interesting, right? I don't know, but let's keep going. She thought for a moment and asked, so now that you know you're half elf, half human, are things going to be different now? Is anything going to change between us? I shook my head and said, no, I don't think so. I believe that I'm going to be better than I was before. I'm not going to be the Dane that I was all of those years ago. I won't let Ayani's control haunt me anymore. She smiled and said, that's good. I'm happy for you, Dane. You said that you wanted to find yourself, and in the middle of nowhere, you eventually did. I smiled, then stopped walking for a moment and gave Maya a warm hug. She smiled and embraced it. Then I said, meeting you was the first step to finding myself. Thank you for everything. She sighed and said, as always, you're welcome. We let go of each other and looked ahead of us. I smiled and asked, all right, shall we venture into the unknown? She nodded and said, let's see what we can find. After walking for a while, we noticed something in the distance. Maya squinted and asked, what is that? I shrugged and said, I'm not sure, but let's take a closer look. As we got closer and closer, we found a town that looked like a carnival or a circus. I looked around and said, it looks like we're in Sacred Grove, but I know for a fact that we're not. Maya nodded and said, the pathing looks the same, but I've never seen anything like this in the places we've been to. I looked up at a sign near the entrance of the town and it read, welcome to Underworld, home to the lost. So, actually, these two images, that's official Free Realms concept art. Like, this is concept art, and this is like an early build of the Underworld. Now, obviously, the Underworld was going to be an actual location in Free Realms, like Silver Hills or Black Forest, but I made it into something else. Like, I basically made it into a place where, you know, it's called the Underworld. Like, you obviously think, oh, death and all that, but I gave it its own spin, and I think you guys are gonna like it. So let's keep going. I tilted my head and asked, the lost? Does that refer to us? She shrugged and said, maybe. It could be referring to a different kind of loss, but let's take it as a sign of hope. I nodded and we entered the Underworld. We walked around the Underworld and saw multiple structures that looked more colorful than anything in Sacred Grove. I looked at Maya and asked, why would Valerian keep all of this from us? She shrugged and said, there has to be more to this place than meets the eye. Valerian wouldn't have kept it a secret otherwise. After passing through a few buildings, we came across people we hadn't seen before in Sacred Grove. They were translucent, like you could see through them, but they were physically here. Oh, shoot. I'm not going to explain my writing style to you guys, but I don't capitalize the word were. Why am I doing that? Stop. Brick. Okay, are we good? Boy, oh boy. Maya turned to me and asked, ghosts, are we dead? I shook my head and said, we're not, but I have a hunch that they are. At least we're not alone, Maya. She nodded and said, that's true. It could be worse, I suppose. I thought for a moment and then said, speaking of, we need to get back to Sacred Grove. Chugsy, Chatty, and Kale won't be able to hold their own for much longer. She sighed and said, Dane, you heard Valerian and Darkthorn. They both said that we'd be stuck here forever, and that we won't be able to return to Sacred Grove. I nodded and said, I know. However, we've done the impossible before. We can do it again. As I said that, a voice called out to us and said, Dane and Maya, we've been expecting you. I took a step back and saw a skeleton approach us, then asked, Who are you and how do you know us? He chuckled and said, Good question indeed. I go by Grim in these parts, but you might have known me as Harry in Sacred Grove. To answer your other question, everyone here knows you. The saviors of Sacred Grove. Maya tilted her head and asked, What did you mean by expecting us? Did you know we were coming? He thought for a moment and said, We did, yes. There's lots of people that I'd like you to meet, besides myself. So before we end the video here, this guy, the skeleton, apparently, like, Underworld is supposed to be like a place where a bunch of the Halloween entities live, and oh, hold on. Kind of the main character of the Underworld is Harry. So I don't know. To me, I think it's pretty interesting to have like a main character of the Underworld, and there is a few main characters in the Underworld that I'm gonna be happy to introduce. So that's gonna be part 4 for today, but we're gonna move on to chapter 21 and beyond. We'll be finishing this up in the next video. But anywho, thank you guys for watching. If you did, as always, I appreciate a ton, and I will see you guys in the next video. And yeah, goodbye.